So warmly welcome everyone to our very first event hosted by the Nordic SIFs. We are today having a great representation from Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. So it's been great to see such widespread interest for our event today. And the idea behind our Nordic collaboration across the SIFs has of course been to share knowledge across borders and to provide perspectives on sustainability topics that are high on the agenda across the Nordics. And of course, one of these topics is child rights, which we will be talking about today, and especially child rights from an investor perspective. So how child rights can be integrated into, say, investment decision making, what are some of the best practices, possible challenges within the area, and so forth. I have the great pleasure to work as today's event moderator. As a brief introduction, my name is Petra Hakamo. I work as the head of sustainability at Evli. We're a Finnish wealth management company based in Helsinki. And next to my day-to-day job, I also work as board member at FinSIF. And personally, the topic of child rights is very close to my heart. We've been working closely on child rights research over the past year, for instance, together with UNICEF. So really happy that the topic is now getting more and more attention, also from the investor space. But looking at our agenda today, we have some fantastic speakers on board. First off, we'll have keynotes from Outi Kauppinen at UNICEF Finland, as well as Matthew Goodwin from Global Child Forum. And they'll be diving into the topics of child rights in general, in investing, and in tech. And after that, we'll have a panel together with Caroline Kleth Eriksen from NBIM, as well as Tytti Kaasinen from the Council on Ethics for the Swedish National Pension Funds. And here we'll be talking about concrete examples on how child rights can be integrated into investment processes, how engagement can be pursued, and so forth. And throughout the session, if you have any questions popping up, feel free to write them in the chat, and we'll have a chance to address them after each of the keynotes and then in the very end of the session as well. But let's kick off. First off, we have Outi from UNICEF. So warmly welcome, Outi. And the stage is yours. Feel free to share your slides.
Thank you so much, Petra, for the introduction. Let me just get my presentation going here. There we go. Excellent. So thanks again, Petra, and a warm welcome to everybody from my side as well. It is absolutely fabulous to see all of you here today. What we're going to talk about for the next hour and a half is child rights and investing. So let us, in this first part, set the scene for the rest of the discussion. What we're going to be talking about is what are the business impacts on child rights, and also what are some ways to manage those impacts. We will go briefly over the UNICEF tool for investors, which gives guidance for investors, asset managers, and others, and how to integrate child rights into ESG assessments. So to kick off, I wanted to show you this quote by Professor John Ruggie, who of course is the author of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. He said, "Children are among the most marginalized and vulnerable members of society and can be disproportionately, severely, and permanently impacted by business activities, operations, and relationships." So let us unpack this for a little bit. There are about 2.4 billion children in the world, which is about a third of the entire global population. And children are vulnerable for a few different reasons, really. The first one is that children's mental, physical, and emotional development is still underway. And this means that they can be harmed by things that adults wouldn't necessarily be harmed by, such as toxins, which, for instance, for children's developing lungs are more severe than for adults because children intake more air per body weight unit than adults do. This is just one example. These harms are many, and they may have long-term effects, sometimes even lifelong consequences. Also, children are also, by and large, a hidden stakeholder group for business. So, for instance, in company policies and due diligence processes, apologies, somebody has the microphone on. Thank you. So to start this point again, so children are by and large a hidden stakeholder group for business. So they're not very well seen in company policies and processes, and children are often sort of just lumped in with human rights and not treated as a separate stakeholder group in their own right. So children might be considered, well, actually, they're not really considered because usually businesses will consult adults or parents when they want to know about issues that are important. So while children are affected by business actions as the employees, family members, or members of communities, companies usually don't specifically dig for information on children. And as we will see today, it really is necessary to dig this information out first to mitigate risk and also because it can provide additional insight that brings concrete business benefits like solutions to existing sustainability challenges, as we'll see later. And finally, children have a really difficult time advocating for themselves also. They don't vote, they don't sit on company boards, and so they have a hard time making themselves seen. Thus, it is the responsibility of adults, of companies to do this work. Let's first talk a little bit about child labor, because when we talk to companies and investors about child rights and business, the very first thing that we usually get back is child labor, and rightly so. Child labor is still a huge problem in the world, with 160 million children globally in child labor, which is work that has adverse effects on children's safety, on their physical and mental health, or like their moral development. So child labor obviously has very negative consequences for children. It harms their growth, it robs them of an education, and through that of prospects for a better future. This is a very salient human rights issue from the perspective of these children. But at the same time, it's also important to note that child labor is a financially material issue for business. We know that poor management of children's rights impacts can lead to a whole host of problems like commercial or legal or reputational risk, and they can have a negative impact on business profitability or competitiveness. And in the case of child labor, the materiality issue is very clear because companies that have been found to use child labor either in their own operations or in their supply chains might have a difficult time obtaining financing in the future, or they might be boycotted or blacklisted by customers or consumers, and there might even be some sort of legal consequences like fines and sanctions. So it turns out that there's a lot that investors can do to combat child labor. For instance, you focus on risk to children over risk to business. You need to engage with the root causes. So one of the big root causes for child labor is poverty, and this relates to businesses paying a living wage that is enough to take care of the employee and his or her family. You can move away from audit compliance approaches to prevention approaches and engage with other stakeholders. But I think the big takeaway here with this whole child labor discussion is that while materiality and salience are distinct concepts in their own right, they are very much interlinked. And this is true with child labor, but this is very much true with other child rights topics as well. So let's now go deeper into what kinds of business material risk exist with child rights. This is a graphic that comes from the Children's Rights and Business Principles that were launched in 2012. They are a set of principles that guide companies and actions that they can take in the workplace, the marketplace, the community, and the environment to respect and support children's rights. So we have already discussed child labor, but the message I want to get across here is that the impacts that businesses have on children are way wider. They're much, much bigger than just child labor. So if we look at this graphic right here and first look at the workplace, children are impacted through the working conditions of their parents and caregivers. For instance, does the company pay a living wage? Are the working hours reasonable? Is parental leave provided? Are breastfeeding breaks provided? Childcare. So in other words, do your parents and caregivers have the resources they need to take care of their families? This also very much relates to diversity and inclusion initiatives that many companies are taking on these days. So do we provide employment opportunities for people from diverse backgrounds? Do we create the kind of inclusive company cultures that allow these people to flourish, to feel valued, to feel safe? And sort of at the other side of the coin, do we provide the children of today with role models of different kinds of people working in different positions? So if you're a small child and you want to be a CEO, but you don't see anybody who looks like you in that role, then it might be different to imagine that kind of future for yourself. If we move on to the marketplace, then products and services obviously need to be created in a way that are safe for children. This also includes digital technologies, which right now are fundamentally changing the way that children interact with each other and with society. It brings a lot of good by way of learning opportunities, keeping in touch, getting information. But of course, there's also a lot of harm that comes from the internet, for instance, through inappropriate contact like grooming or cyberbullying and things like that, and also relating to children's data governance and, for instance, how AI systems are designed to make sure that there's no inbuilt bias that might harm children. So there's a lot of risk here. There's a lot companies can do. And then finally, an example from here relates to marketing and advertising, which is marketing of unhealthy foods to children, particularly to teenagers who already have pocket money to spend and who are very susceptible to these advertisements. And in fact, this kind of advertising has been shown to lead to negative health outcomes for kids. Okay, so if we move down to the bottom, there is the community and the environment. And we know that kids are more vulnerable than adults to pollution and climate change. For instance, with security arrangements, how do security guards at shopping malls, for instance, treat children that on the one hand are hanging out, but on the other might be loitering? So do these interactions happen in a way that is in the best interest of the child? Or for instance, in the extractives industry, if you set up a mine somewhere and you have to move a community to a different location, then how is the new location? Is it child friendly? Is there a school? Do they have access to healthcare? So a lot of issues here. So sort of to wrap this slide up, if we don't understand that the different potential child rights impacts of companies, we miss a lot of potential risk. At the same time, we miss a lot of potential opportunity, because when we apply a child lens, so to speak, we can bring additional depth and understanding to sustainability work and potentially considerable benefits business-wise, as well, as we're going to see with the next example that relates to family-friendly policies. So on to managing child rights impacts and family-friendly policies at a glance. So we just talked about child rights issues that businesses face in the workplace with regard to employees, and family-friendly policies can be a very powerful tool to support working parents and caregivers to take care of their families. And at UNICEF, we categorize family-friendly policies into 3 dimensions. There's time, which is paid parental, family, and sick leave, breastfeeding support, as in providing breastfeeding breaks during the workday, and flexible work arrangements. Then there is resources, paying a living wage, and potentially child benefits, especially in low-wage employment situations, and then services. So, for instance, employer-supported access to quality childcare. There is a wealth of evidence that shows that parental leave, childcare, and breastfeeding support in the workplace translate into positive outcomes for children. That is like in relation to health, nutrition, education, and so forth. Also, we see more and more evidence on how these benefit businesses themselves. For instance, as regards to attracting and retaining your skilled and diverse workforce, which is an issue for a lot of companies these days. Then we're going to shine a quick spotlight on parental leave. So we know that an adequate period of paid parental leave ensures that both mothers and fathers have the necessary time to bond with and care for their young children. So while here in the Nordics, paid parental leave is the norm, this is certainly not the case in many other corners of the globe. And some companies have taken it upon themselves to provide benefits for their employees. And here now is an example of Lego on how they introduced a policy of parental leave for their employees worldwide. Today, as far as management of child rights impacts, we have the opportunity to look at family-friendly policies, but I want to highlight that there is a whole host of guidance available that relates to a wide range of child rights impacts. If you want to dive in when you have the need, there's information on responsible marketing, children's online safety, supply chains, and a whole host of other issues, including the whole due diligence process and child rights. So if in doubt, please reach out. All right, so we've gone through business impact on children and also a little bit about how to manage those impacts. And for the last part, I just wanted to show you one of those tools. I just spoke about tools and guidance that is available. There is something that we specifically have for investors. Well, there's a few things we have specifically for investors, but today we're going to highlight the tool for investors on integrating children's rights into ESG assessments. So this tool was basically developed for companies on how to manage and address risks to children. It's very useful for institutional investors, asset owners and asset managers, ESG researchers, companies themselves, and to others. It does not create any new expectations. There are no new standards here. It's about translating existing standards into metrics that investors can use to assess company due diligence. There are indicators. I will show you a little bit about the setup of the tool on the next follow-up slides. But the indicators are based on existing standards and norms, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Guiding Principles, the OECD guidelines, and the Children's Rights and Business Principles. And the tool should give any user, first of all, an understanding of whether children's rights are material, and two, the ability to assess the actual policies and performance of companies. And the idea is that this is practical and adaptable, and this could be there could be items from this that can be adapted into your existing framework in a variety of contexts. So just to look at the overview of the tool, there are 3 parts. The first part relates to materiality guidance. And this tool takes a dual materiality approach where salience and materiality are closely interlinked. And the idea here is to give investors an understanding of how companies impact children's rights and give a good basis to evaluate the materiality of child rights for the companies that investors are looking to assess. The second part of the tool is the actual assessment indicators, and there are 30 plus indicators in the tool. I will show you a little bit more about that on the next slide. The idea is not that investors would take all of these and run away with them, but rather take the ones that feel relevant and then work with those. We also suggest some exclusions, some that are commonly used, but we have also introduced one that is not so common, which is a violation of the Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, which is a big issue for children's rights. And then finally, the part 3 is data collection and sources. And this gives guidance on where to find data on company commitments and practices. So some common frameworks and common sources of data. So here is a little bit about the design of the indicators. They are structured in 2 categories. First, there are general due diligence indicators, and these are ones that should be applicable to all types of companies, so they are industry agnostic. And then the second part deals with issue and function indicators, and these, the use of these would somewhat depend on the context in which the company operates and the activities that it undertakes. So for instance, there are some indicators on marketing to children, which would be particularly applicable for those companies that market and advertise and target children. We have also proposed some scoring on a 5-grade scale, but this was designed in a way that hopefully allows the user to adapt this to their own system. So your scale could be 0, 1 to 5, or 1 to 10, or however else you see it fit. But the idea with the scoring is that to get a score of 2 means that you are doing super well, your performance is outstanding. It reflects comprehensive management of child rights impacts. And then a score of 1 would reflect a sort of a baseline or a minimum expectation in terms of managing human rights impacts. And a score of 0 indicates that the company is either not addressing this issue or they're not disclosing on it. And we warmly invite investors and asset managers and anybody else who's interested to look at this tool and see if some of these indicators could be integrated into your existing frameworks and to see if these might add value to your analysis. So today we've talked about how to integrate child rights into investment decision-making, into ESG analysis. Of course, there are lots of other ways in which investors can take child rights into account, how they can promote them, for instance, stewardship activities. And hopefully we will hear a lot more about the practical application of all these with the next speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Outi. Great insights. For the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat or raise your voice. That works as well. So we have a few minutes for questions, so feel free to ask questions. In the meantime, I would have a question regarding the materiality for businesses. So in the beginning, you were talking about child rights from the kind of materiality perspective, and you had a division between workplace, marketplace, community. So where do you see are some of the biggest issues today where investors should pay more attention to?
Thanks, Petra, for that question. I think that one of the big issues that a lot of companies are facing, I think I referred to this earlier, was retaining your motivated workforce. And in those cases, lots of companies can do activities and initiatives that target your workforce, like give gifts or presents or organize events and things like that. But really what makes a really big difference for people is what is the everyday at your job, especially for those people who have families and have family requirements. So in that case, if you apply the child lens, then it might give you additional information about what it is that makes your employees stick. And if you have flexible work arrangements, for instance, if you encourage, like in the Nordic context, encourage the father or the other parent to take leave as well when a child is born, then that all creates the kind of culture where people feel like they are safe and that they can take care of themselves and their families, and it makes that employment situation so much better.
Makes sense. Thank you. Maybe still one more question from my side. Later on today, we'll be talking about IT and tech, but otherwise, are there any other key sectors that you see where child rights should be taken better into consideration at the moment? Any sectors to spotlight?
Absolutely. And actually, if you look through the tool for investors, the tool for investors goes through child rights and the impacts specific impacts that they have on different industries. So if you look through the document, for instance, there are specific issues that relate to the food and beverage industry, that relate to consumer goods, and that relate to extractives, travel and tourism, and of course the tech sector. But this gives a very, very nice overview of those specific issues. So if you are an analyst who is responsible, for instance, for the food and beverage sector, absolutely go look at this document, and you'll be able to very easily identify those specific issues that relate to your companies.
Very good. And for those in the audience for whom the tool for investors isn't known yet, we at least have been going through it at Evli, and really can say that it's really helpful in kind of categorizing what investors should pay attention to when starting to consider child rights. Great. In case there are other questions, we still have time for that also in the end. But for now, I would thank Outi for the great presentation. And next up, we have Matt Goodwin from Global Child Forum. So great to have you here, Matt.
Thank you so much, and thank you for a really interesting presentation, Outi. Before I start, as I'm trying to upload these slides, I must say that it's so great to have so many faces and names that I know on a call about something that's such an important topic and so close to all our hearts. So thank you all for taking the time to join. You should be seeing slides any second now. Petra, maybe give me a thumbs up when you can see them. You can see them. Excellent.
Yep.
Okay. So I hope that after my mini presentation, you will take away two key points. The first is that companies globally are not doing enough when it comes to children and children's rights, and this will include companies that you're investing in. And secondly, as investors, you should feel encouraged and empowered to make a difference. There are free tools and services out there. Outi's just mentioned some of the UNICEF ones. We share our underlying benchmark data for free to help investors incorporate children's rights into ESG risk assessments and stewardship. And many of your peers, many of whom are on this call, are already doing this. So my name is Matt Goodwin, and I'm Head of Sustainable Investing at Global Child Forum. We were founded by these two, who you may recognize, the King and Queen of Sweden. They founded us in 2009, and our core activity is publishing the world's largest benchmark on how businesses impact children. And we do this in collaboration with Boston Consulting Group, who are our pro bono partners. And as I mentioned, the underlying data is free for all in the financial sector. So before I go into some of the key findings in the tech and telecom sector, let me briefly talk you through our benchmark and our assessment to give some context for the discussion we're going to have. So The benchmark is based on the Children's Rights and Business Principles, which Uti has just spoken about. And this was written by SAVE, the UN Global Compact, and UNICEF, I think it was 11 years ago. And we use this framework to assess companies on publicly available information across 25 indicators. And these indicators are split across 4 impact areas. So governance and collaboration, and then the 3 areas that Uti spoke about. So workplace, marketplace, community, environment. And I won't go into those in any more detail because Uti's given quite a good run through of what they mean. We also then assess companies across 3 maturity levels as part of this. So we look at the stated intentions of companies through policies and commitments. We look at how these are implemented through processes, and then we look at the outcome via reporting and actions. So how do companies perform on the benchmarks, I suppose, is the interesting question. Now, I haven't been organized enough to organize a poll, but as I move to the next slide, all have a really quick think. Out of 10, how well do you think companies should perform when it comes to their impact on children? And I will pause very momentarily to let you have a quick think and for some extra dramatic effect. In short, companies don't do very well. So what I've done on this slide is to present the total average scores, all out of 10, for the last 3 benchmarks that we've done. So in 2021, we did a global benchmark. We also did a tech and telecom deep dive that year, and we did a deep dive for the food, beverage, and personal care sector. And as you can see, 5.4, 5.2, and 4.4 out of 10 are consistently quite low scores. I imagine that you would have both thought and hoped that they would be higher than this. So what's driving these low scores? Well, one of the key drivers is a real absence of leaders. And we define leaders as companies that score 7.5 or more out of 10. So what I've done here is to present the percentage of these leaders in the last 3 benchmarks. So 9, 13, and 7% of top performers, again, is quite consistently low. And to add to this, only 1 company across the last 3 benchmarks has scored full marks across all 25 indicators, so 25 pens, which is a little bit disappointing. On the flip side, there are also too many beginners. So we would define these as companies scoring between 0 and 2.5 out of 10 on the benchmark. Now, I acknowledge that the global benchmark here at 9% is a bit of an outlier, but 17% and 26% on the last 2 deep dives are a large number of low-performing companies on the benchmark. Interestingly, in comparison to the last slide, where 1 company scored full marks, quite a number scored 0s across the 25 indicators. So 3% of the food and beverage benchmark and 1.5% of the tech and telecom benchmark all scored straight 0s. And the trend is that these companies are typically from the global south, although there is global representation. And to close the loop here, so we have 4 performance buckets, and in the middle are improvers and achievers. And as you can see from this slide, a large number of the companies we benchmark sit in this middle ranging score. So what do we find if we look at a specific benchmark in more detail? Let's take a look at the Tech and Telecom report. So we split our study in this sector into 3 sub-industries. And these sub-industries, electronics, telecommunications, and IT software and services, all scored quite differently. At the top were electronics. So these are companies that manufacture electronic devices, scored a total average score of 6 out of 10. So what drove this score? Well, they had the highest share of leaders and achievers, so the top scoring buckets, and they outperformed the other industries on issues like child labour, family-friendly policies, and supply chains. So these are part of our workplace impact area. Also, interestingly, in this sector, it's quite a diverse sector, and we found that companies that are close to the consumer market tended to score much better than those that were a bit more removed. In second place were telecommunications, with an average score of 5 out of 10, and these are companies that host and build telecommunications systems. So what drove their score of 5 out of 10? Well, They had the same number of leaders as the electronics industry, so the top performers, but their score was dramatically impacted by the large number of beginners, so the bottom performers. In fact, 24% of the telecommunications industry scored were beginners. The industry did quite well, relatively speaking, in terms of product safety and responsible marketing. Many companies in the study had policies and programs to both protect and support children online as they interact online. Although I hasten to add that this is relative success. Overall, the scores were still quite low, and we'll come on to that in another slide. Lagging behind were IT software and services with 4.3. So companies that provide online services like social media, etc. So why were these so far behind the other two? Well, they had the highest share of 0 scores across all indicators. They had no leaders at all, and a large number of the companies here scored less than 5 out of 10 on the benchmark, at 63% in fact. The industry scored relatively well on policies and commitments, but fell well behind electronics and telecommunications when it came to disclosing implementation and outcomes. In terms of geographical trends, so Europe was a top performer, North America in second place, Latin America and the Caribbean were the bottom performer, and the delta between top and bottom at 3.5 out of 10 is quite a significant difference. How these different global regions performed in this study is quite a common theme that we see across the benchmarks, reflecting the comparative regional maturity when it comes to sustainability and human rights responsibilities. So something that Ute touched on as well, that the marketplace. So a key finding from the benchmark here is that very few companies consider how their marketing, advertising, and products and services impact children. And this is assessed in our marketplace area, and the marketplace average score for the benchmark was quite a low 3.4 out of 10. And what the results show is that very few companies understand children, whether as intended or unintended users of products or services, or intended or unintended parts of their external messaging audience, are a vulnerable group that needs greater protection than adults. And this creates a really lost opportunity on 2 key fronts. The first is that the tech and telecom sector could be conducting downstream assessments to understand the impact of their products on children, to protect them from online bullying, exploitation, radicalism, all sorts of things. But this is not being done enough. They could also be designing products that set children up for a bright start in life. And this sector has an enormous potential here. We all saw this during COVID-19 as children were able to continue learning online and socializing with friends. But it's alarming to note that almost half of the surveyed companies don't report on a program related to product development for positive social impact. And there's so much opportunity in this space to combine business and social good, but this is really, as I said, a lost opportunity. And linking back to what Ute said before, this finding is sadly not unique to tech and telecom. We see a very similar issue in the recent food, beverage and personal care benchmark that we did in December last year, and in other benchmarks that we've conducted. So this is the final sort of key finding that I want to talk about. There are lots more that you can see as part of our report on the various studies that we've done. So please do take a look at those on the website if you're interested, or reach out. We're happy to share more. But this key finding, which I kind of referred to earlier, shows that there's a significant disconnect between companies' stated intentions through policies and commitments and how these are implemented and followed up on. And the data on this slide, on the left-hand side, the left-hand circles, shows that companies perform actually quite okay when it comes to policies and commitments, so all scoring 5.6 or higher. When this comes to implementation of policies and transparent outcomes and reporting, there's a significant drop-off at both levels, which is a concern. And as I mentioned on an earlier slide, the drop-off is most pronounced for IT software and services. So what can you do with the data and these findings? So today, investors worth a combined value of over $7 trillion are using our underlying benchmark data. And this includes a number of your peers on this call. And the data is being used in a number of different ways, but to highlight two. The first is related to stewardship. So many stewardship teams have mapped their portfolios to our data to understand exactly which indicators portfolios perform poorly on. And for example, this could be some of the marketplace issues that we've spoken about today. What they then do is incorporate these into stewardship strategies or plans for yearly dialogues with companies. And we've developed a list of 25 questions, each one linked to an indicator, which we've shared with the financial sector as well to help them start having conversations with investors, because it's not an easy topic just to pick up without some background knowledge. And that's been appreciated. The second thing we've seen is that investors suck up all our data and upload them into internal ESG platforms. So thereby making the data available to everybody internally, but also in some cases affecting the internal ESG scores for companies. And as you all know, this has all sorts of knock-on effects when a company's ESG internal rating changes. And our data is given a weighting alongside all sorts of other data that's pulled from Bloomberg, other NGOs, and all types of other sources. That's the first thing I wanted to mention. And the second is we have recently written to, or the letters are actually going out this week, to a large number of companies from the tech and telecom and food and beverage benchmarks we did, asking them to improve on some key weaknesses that we've identified in the benchmark. And one of these was the marketplace area that I've spoken about. So this letter's been being led by some amazing individuals at Swedbank Robur, but a further 20 Nordic investors, many of whom are on this call, have agreed to sign the letters. And they are combined worth 875 billion euros. So thank you to everybody who's been part of that. Like I said, all this is for free. So if you're interested in joining future coalitions or using the data, please just reach out to me. We're also building an ESG sector risk score at the moment, and that will be available soon. I'd like to leave you with two things as I conclude. The first are my contact details. Please feel free to reach out. And the second is an old African proverb, which goes that it takes a village to raise a child. Now, we don't live in villages anymore. We live in global interconnected societies. So it takes these global interconnected societies and economies to raise the next generation properly. So hopefully we can together be a part of that. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I think I might have some time for some questions as well.
Thank you so much, Matt. Very, very interesting insights on your benchmark study. If there are any questions from the audience, we have a few minutes time. Maybe a question from myself. You were talking about differences in the benchmark scores across regions. For instance, global versus Europe versus, but was this geographical scoring based on where the company is headquartered or where the operations are based, or how was that done?
Good question. So we look at where the company is headquartered primarily, but it's a catch-all benchmark. So the way the questions are framed takes into account their sort of global operations. But we have to sort of allocate a country and a region to them. So AstraZeneca, for example, could well be based in 3 different countries, but we allocate them to Sweden, for example. But the benchmark looks at their global supply chains and stuff like that.
Makes sense. Maybe another question regarding the tech and telecom scoring. You said that electronics outperformed compared to telecom and IT software, for instance, on child labor commitments and policies. But do you see there a potential dilemma taking place that in the sectors where disclosure is the highest, that's also where the biggest issues are when it comes to child rights? So is there a potential dilemma with the scoring, and how has this been handled, if so?
That's a very good question, and it kind of goes to the heart of children's rights and what we do about it. And there is obviously a situation in which companies that are better at reporting on, say, child labour get caught for child labour more often because they're the ones disclosing it. But we believe that in order to create a better world, we need to be reporting on issues and improving on them, and transparency is a key part of this. So we don't look at the necessary, on what a company is. We don't look at, say, the number of cases of child labour. That's sort of, we don't look at that. But I take your point. But for us, transparency is the key thing that we look at and consider in that respect.
Great, thank you. We have a hand raised. Birna, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Birna. I work for UNICEF in Iceland. Thank you for the presentation. One of the key issues you mentioned was the lack of leaders in the field. But could you define for us, what is a leader according to your benchmark? What does it take to become a leader? Just to give us an idea of what is the ideal. Thank you.
Well, I suppose that the boring definition of leader means that you need to score a 10, or you need to be scoring on average a 7.5 on all the different areas. So it means you need to be strong in all areas of the children's rights and business principles that Ute spoke about. So you need to have strong governance and issues. So, for example, the board might need to be accountable for certain children's rights issues in certain areas. You have to have, across the 3 maturity levels, a strong, you've got to be on top of children's rights issues like supply chain, child labour, family-friendly policies. You have to be able to deal with how you impact local communities, local environments, global communities. And then in terms of the issues we spoke about in the workplace, you need to be thinking about how you develop products and services, the way they impact children, and you have to have policies and procedures in place to give you a solid grasp of how you market to children, whether directly or indirectly. So you need to have a complete grasp of all of these areas to score as a leader. I hope I answered you. I'm not our benchmark expert. I'm the financial sector expert, but hopefully that gives you a flavour for what a leader is. Thanks for the thumbs up.
Any further questions or thoughts from the audience before we move on to our panel? If not, thanks a lot, Matt. We'll get back to you in the end of the session with Q&A. But now we'll move on to our panel together with Caroline from NBIM and Ute from Council on Ethics. So great to have you here both. So the idea is to have an informal panel discussion with the two of you, and as before, if there are any questions in the audience, feel free to post them in the chat. But starting off with you, Caroline, NBIM has been showing great example on how to take child rights into consideration and how to integrate them into the investment process. So can you tell us a bit more about why child rights are important to you guys at NBIM?
Yes, absolutely, Petra, and thanks for having me as part of the discussion today. So for NBIM, we are a long-term fund. We are a fund for future generations of Norwegians. So it's a very natural place for us to start to focus on children's rights. We invest for the long term, and as I said, for future generations. So in fact, child rights was the first sustainability topic on which NBIM published its expectations as an investor in 2008. And these are regularly updated and provide the sort of foundation for our ownership work, stewardship work on these topics. And we recognize that child rights can be salient and material issues for companies we invest in. They, respecting child rights is really for us a core part of responsible business conduct. And it's at the same time an essential part of good risk management, considering potential, impacts on children, for example, in your supply chain. That is good risk management. So we base our expectations on to the companies we invest in, which are over 9,000 companies across 70 markets. We're a globally diversified investor. We base these expectations on the international standards, the UNGPs, the OECD guidelines, and of course the child rights and business principles. So we want to, as an investor, we recognize that we also have an expectation and a duty to do our own due diligence. So that's why we regularly integrate child rights into our investment assessments, our stewardship, and we want to use our leverage to ensure that companies we invest in respect human rights and children's rights, of course.
Very good. And can you give some more concrete examples on how child rights are integrated into the investment process and maybe stewardship as well?
Yep, I'm happy to. So responsible investment is part of our mandate. And we approach this in 3 dimensions. So first, we work focused at the market level. That's where we want to contribute to better market practices, a level playing field for the companies we invest in. So we regularly engage with regulators and standard setters on topics that are relevant for us as an investor, which includes sustainability topics and human rights and children's rights. And we may also engage collectively with companies that we are invested in sort of industry initiatives where we see a shared challenge and would like to explore good practices and create, for example, practical guidance, or along with other investors in discussing and sharing challenges and opportunities. The second aspect of our responsible investment work is at the portfolio level. And that's where we, first of all, can make data available internally. So, for example, as Matt mentioned, that's a really important thing to which data is available for portfolio managers, for stewardship teams, and risk monitoring teams to integrate into their assessments and decision making. We also look at child rights as part of our environmental and social due diligence screens that we do on a quarterly basis, in addition to daily monitoring of the portfolio. So child rights is an important topic there. And there may be some companies that we don't want to be invested in because we do not think that their business models are sustainable in the long term. In those cases, we can do risk-based divestments, and these are investment decisions, and we map them to sustainability topics that our expectations cover, including children's rights. So we may also use that as a tool. But our preferred tool, and where we really want to focus, is to be an owner. We prefer to be an owner and impact companies over time in the direction of our investment, of our expectations. So based on the expectation documents that I mentioned earlier. And this really, consists of 2 main things: the dialogues, the direct dialogues with the companies that we are invested in. We have about 3,000 company meetings per year in recent years, where both portfolio managers and corporate governance experts participate. And they, for example, on the topic of children's rights, may focus on child labor, health and nutrition, safety online. There are numerous topics that come up as part of these dialogues. And we also use voting. We vote on shareholder proposals and publish our votes 5 days ahead of AGMs. So these are important tools for us as an investor, and it gives us an opportunity to be transparent about how we approach ownership on related to children's rights, and also a way to impact companies over time.
Very good insights. Thank you, Caroline. Maybe then turning on to you, how do you see the engagement perspective when it comes to child rights, and what kind of cooperation can be held with stakeholders?
Great. Yes, thank you. And thank you, Caroline, for setting us off. It's an honor to be in a panel with NBIM, who's such a long time been such a path breaker and leading by example on this topic. So I think it's very inspirational, hopefully, for all of us online. And as I was preparing for this webinar, I realized that I've been working on this topic for exactly 10 years myself. It was 2013 when I was first working with the Global Child Forum, actually. in my then capacity as at the GES. So it's great that this topic has made it to be the first pan-Nordic webinar. So thank you also to Petra for being the driving force behind this. So anyway, engagement. I think engagement lends itself particularly well for this kind of topic where the materiality is maybe not completely established yet, and the data and reporting is far from spot on and standardized, as we've heard in the previous presentations. And that might make it harder to integrate children's rights in investment analysis and financial analysis and kind of stock assessments. So if the quantitative side feels a bit challenging, the qualitative assessment, helped by discussions with companies, can be a handy tool for you to understand what kind of preparedness and awareness the companies in your portfolios or potential investors have. And also, of course, it's a very good tool for advocating for better child rights management and also reporting to help get that data to us and out there. So the lack of data doesn't have to mean lack of opportunities for active ownership is the first thing that I should say. Then I think all of us investors have a lot of topics that we would like to engage on, and we'd like to kind of encourage our portfolio companies to become better at, and where we are expected to act actively. But if you feel like you can't have children's rights as well as one of your standalone focus areas, I have good news. It doesn't have to be. You can and actually should assess and integrate children's rights in all other areas where you're already working on anyway. As we saw in OT's presentation, children are not some entity that somehow exists outside the business or outside the society or outside the sectors that you're invested in or working on, but it's quite the opposite. It's everywhere. But at the same time, I'm not advocating for you to ask about children's rights with all the companies that you come in touch with that could actually risk diluting the issue and make it a tick the box exercise. So it's good to carry out thorough risk analysis, utilizing the tools that we've heard in this webinar from UNICEF and Global Child Forum, and pick the companies or engagements or sectors or geographies where child rights is a particularly material and relevant risk or opportunity. As a side point, when I talk about children's rights, I always highlight that children are not only some risks and victims, but they are also full of potential, literally, as the people that will define our future. And even more imminently, and from the business perspective, it's good to remember that they can actually provide business benefits. And so the gaps in reporting or behavior could also be a sign of companies missing out on opportunities for them to benefit from products or services and policies aligning with the needs of children and their families as well as workers. So in terms of engagement and picking your battles and having impactful or your stewardship activities to have an impactful consequences, and at least we at the Council on Ethics, we are keen to focus our stewardship activities where we can really add value and make a difference, and also make sure that when we do something, it has an impact. So maybe for people on the line as well, if you're considering what sectors and topics to act on when it comes to children's rights, considering your portfolio exposure and where you have already inroads to influence companies who might be missing or mismanaging their risks and opportunities might be a good way to kind of prioritize and find where you can start from or really make a difference, get bang for your buck. So the approach that we have taken at the Council on Ethics is to include child-related issues in engagements wherever it's relevant, even if the headline topic for that particular initiative or project can be something else sometimes. So some examples are, for example, I think many of you have heard of the Mining 2030 initiative, which looks at the mining sector and extractive sector more broadly across various issues. And children's rights are, of course, relevant there as well, particularly child labor, but also as members of the communities where mining companies are central. So that's one area where we think is very important and a good way to make sure that children's rights stays on the agenda, where in those dialogues. Another area is children's rights or child labor in a cocoa supply chain, where we have been working on with other investors and service providers for a long time. Maybe a more traditional children's rights issue being child labor in agriculture. And then most recently, recent example is our project on tech and human rights, where of course children being at the front line are very much affected and driving even the developments of internet platforms and how they influence us as a society. And then final point regarding the cooperation, I think that's super important. I think generally we as investors, we can and should be much better in coordinating our efforts within our investment community and equally importantly with other stakeholders. Trying to do everything on our own is rarely the most efficient or impactful way to influence things. So also, and maybe particularly in an area like children's rights, it's important that we align with what else is out there and utilize the synergies that we have with others who are also wanting to improve things. And systemic issues like this require systemic responses and alignment. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into details with the different kind of stakeholder cooperation, but I can get to that if we have time later. But I think everything from investors to topic specific NGOs to other NGOs or benchmarks which are working on a parallel issue, and then also multinational and international organizations like UN and OECD, there's sort of potential there to work on for example, child-related issues to ensure alignment and joined up approach.
Great insights, Titti. And great insights also to kind of the tech sector that I want to pick your brain about a little later today. Very interesting to hear about that. But still on engagement, Caroline, is there something you'd like to add when it comes to engagement methods that you use and potential stakeholder cooperation before we move on?
Yeah, I can quickly say that I mean I fully agree with Titti on the point about collaborative engagement, that can have, there are many benefits to that, and to working together as investors, working together with a number of companies as well, creating synergies and sharing knowledge, expertise, involving subject matter experts. We've had quite good experiences and had really meaningful and impactful engagement in that way. So I think it can be a really good tool to complement those regular bilateral and direct company engagements. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we've had some good collaboration with UNICEF, for example, on particularly on children's rights.
Great. And Tytti, you pointed out to the tools that we've heard also today about from UNICEF and Global Child Forum. So how do you both see regarding tools and data available to investors today? What's the situation and what would we wish to expect from the future?
You first, Caroline.
Yeah, I can go first. Well, I was going to start by, I mean, obviously, I think if as information is essential, we rely on publicly available information to assess exposure to risk and how companies are managing sustainability risks, including impacts on children. So access to information and data is, very important. I wanted to also say that I agree with the point Tytti made earlier, though, that lack of data doesn't necessarily mean lack of opportunities for ownership. Absolutely agree with that. I mean, we actually reach out to companies every year that are not reporting on sustainability topics, including children's rights, specifically to encourage better reporting, because we think that's a good way for that benefits all stakeholders, including us investors. And we had very good and constructive discussions on those on the basis of those letters, on the basis of missing reporting. But data, of course, is essential, and the data we do have, we use it across to try to map it across the portfolio, like Matt mentioned. And we appreciate that there's a growing number of resources available to investors, benchmarks, reports, tools that we can use to both be inspired, learn from others, and to get new ideas on how to integrate child rights into our own assessments. And for example, the due diligence indicators that was mentioned early on, or the Global Child Forum benchmark, are tools that we find really useful, and it can provide comparable data across a range of companies. Because with an investment portfolio of 9,000 companies, that's the one way that we can narrow down engagement targets and focus our stewardship efforts.
Yeah, and I would just obviously echo all of that, and just to remind everyone on the line that typically disclosure evolves in response to demand. So investors can and should play a really important role in telling companies that they do and need more data or specific kind of data on children's rights issues beyond child labor, which typically is quite well covered at the relevant companies. And I guess not just the companies, but also your service providers, wherever you get your data on other ESG issues, it's good to communicate to those stakeholders as well what kind of information will be useful for you. And then on a more kind of overarching issue when it comes to data, I think it's also important in this area where the data and indicators aren't completely established yet, that we kind of learn from mistakes in other topics and avoid proliferation of frameworks and indicators and somehow sometimes conflicting metrics. And where we can, and I think UNICEF and Global Child Forum can particularly play an important role here when they work with other organizations in the space to try and kind of have standardization from the start almost. Obviously, we are not completely at the start, but to have that line of thinking to begin with, so to make it easier for everyone, not just us as investors, but also companies not having to decide which framework or which indicator different people want. So that would be my wish list, but I have no solutions, but I have lots of wishes.
Thank you, Tytti. And maybe continuing, Tytti, with you regarding the tech sector. You've been involved in a tech project that you kind of opened up a little bit. So can you tell us a bit more about this space?
Yeah, happy to. And you're going to have to stop me because otherwise I'll talk all day about this because I think it's so exciting. So as we've already heard from both Outi and Matt's presentations, the IT sector is, of course, very, very relevant and very both dependent on children as users as well. But it can have a very, very damaging impact on children, but can, on the other hand, can be very important in empowering and supporting children's development. So it's really become one of the key sectors in this space. And the project that we started together with around 30 other investors internationally is focusing on the impacts of internet platforms and information therein on human rights. And particularly kind of content focus and societal impact focus. And we've decided to highlight children explicitly as one of our focus areas, exactly because it deserves to be lifted up from the general human rights assessments or risk analysis or understanding, particularly in this area. So we've defined for our 3-year collaboration or project-specific KPIs through which we can measure both the progress and our impact on company disclosure when it comes to children's rights, but also the more qualitative and implementation type of issues, what's under the hood, what the companies are actually doing besides their public commitments or policies. So we are really looking to concretely incorporate child rights considerations and encourage and ensure that companies consider those risks and impacts on children, not just their users, particularly their users. I think we've all noticed the increasing headlines about impact on mental health, for example, particularly on teenagers. But also otherwise how children as a society and how the societal structures are impacting children and technology being everyday thing for all of us and all of our societies. I think this is an area where it's non-negotiable. It belongs there in those conversations. So through our dialogues with companies, we are really hoping to understand and make sure that as things evolve, and obviously this is a very fast evolving sector, really make sure that they don't wait for things to go wrong, or they don't wait for damage, but they're really proactively thinking when they're developing new services or new business lines, and really proactively aware of the impacts on children. And here the collaboration, of course, is very, very big part of our work. So it being investor collaboration, of course, but as I was defining the indicators for our work, I spoke both with the Global Child Forum and UNICEF, again, to make sure that we are aligned and we are not kind of reinventing the wheel or posing conflicting expectations to the companies. And also there are other organizations like Ranking Digital Rights who don't have a child-related indicator yet, whom I'm talking to about it, and we are obviously they are very happy to hear what kind of data people need or are looking for at the moment. And likewise, organizations like the OECD actually have done a lot of work on children in digital space. And they are working on their first benchmarking on child sexual exploitation and abuse online this year. So this is really an area where I think it really benefits to know what else is going on out there. What does it mean for our work? What does our work mean for them? Where can we align our efforts for mutual benefit? So super exciting project, but I think I'm going to have to stop there because otherwise there's no stopping me.
Thanks, Tytti. What about then challenges regarding considering child rights in business and in investing? Where are the key challenge areas and how have they developed over time? Maybe again, question to both of you. Maybe Tytti, you can start off.
Sure. Yeah, and it really has been interesting to see the development over the past decade. Like for example, tech, it really wasn't coming up in our investor surveys 10 years ago. It was kind of bubbling under or kind of in the periphery. But as society and business evolves, the company overlaps with children also evolves. So that's been really interesting and useful and encouraging to see. In terms of challenges, we talked about data, and of course that will probably always remain a challenge, like with all the other ESG issues as well. Materiality, we've touched on a little bit for some investors who maybe don't have the mandate to think more long term or think more on the system level. They might have trouble justifying or arguing for a particular focus on children's rights if there isn't good enough understanding of the materiality or the direct business risks and opportunities that it has. So I think that's something that has been improving over the years, and I think the work that UNICEF Global Child Forum are doing is great to really help investors understand the practical ways how children play into business. And but I think it still remains a challenge, I think, for many investors who really need more kind of hardcore numbers or financial figures. I don't know if Caroline, you agree there, but happy to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I do. I think data and information is a challenge, and also what you mentioned on materiality, sort of the competing with other important sustainability and material sustainability issues, competing for the attention of companies and investors, and so sort of champions that are focusing on this, and even just taking one little step to start looking at some child rights data for the portfolio, how companies are exposed, or I think is important if investors are just starting out looking at this topic. I would say another challenge is sort of the ways children are impacted is evolving. I mean, Tytti also mentioned that, but for example, child labor is a topic that it's a stubborn challenge, right? It impacts companies, it impacts people, companies around the world, and it's in some cases moving lower down the tiers of supply chain. So we see it in different forms in new ways, but it doesn't mean the challenge is necessarily gone. So companies need to be innovative in how they're mapping their risks, how they are engaging with stakeholders and rights holders to keep up the pressure and focus on this important topic.
Yeah, very good. And Caroline, still some final advice to the other investors out there when starting to consider child rights in investing. What should be considered? Now we've heard today about different tools, different sector insights, but where to start?
Yeah, well, I think that's also hard to say in a clear and concise way, but I think what is, if I can mention three things. So the first one would be to sort of be clear about your priorities. Develop a clear view and be transparent and predictable about that view as an owner. Over time, over time, you have an ambition and an aim to impact the companies that you invest in, because this is a long-term game. We don't see change in all the companies every day, but we see it over time. We see them moving in direction of our expectations. So to be a transparent and predictable owner, I would say is the first thing. Then think about what types of data and information that is actually accessible. We say there's not enough and it's not standardized and we want more, but there are tools, and there is actually, as we had presented here today and in other discussions, there are quite a few number of tools and data sources available. So that gives you a good starting point. And then thirdly, think about, as we mentioned before, opportunities to learn from others, engage collectively, if to both learn yourself, contribute, and have an impact. I think that's a great place to start.
Thank you. Really interesting insights. Thank you, Caroline and Tytti. I think now we still have a couple of more minutes for some audience questions for all of the speakers, so we could get Matt and Outi also back on the line in case there are any questions from the audience. Now we'll have some time. Maybe to start off, I have a question regarding the Nordic perspective now that we have different Nordic people on the line. So how do you speakers see differences between, say, the Nordics versus Europe versus the rest of the world when it comes to child rights in business and in investing? So are there some areas where we in the Nordics are leading or lagging in? Any perspectives on this?
I can go first. I mean, we have quite a unique perspective on this, because for the last 18 months, we've tried to reach out to asset managers all over the world to try and get them to use our data. So the fact we're even having this call puts the Nordics well ahead of the rest of the world in terms of trying to deal with the issue from a kind of financial sector perspective. So that's great. I mean, Europe is not far behind, but I don't know if many of you saw the Share Action report recently, where some of the big American investors are kind of at the bottom in terms of ESG. They're the ones we need to kind of get to make to change what they're doing in order to make a difference here, and they're the ones we struggle to have this conversation with. So I mean, I would say the Nordics are well ahead based on the kind of conversations we're having and seeing, but I'd be interested to hear what the feeling from the other panelists is.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Hopefully not too biased opinion, seeing as we here are in Nordics, and of course we like to think that we are doing well. But in our tech engagement, we do have a lot of European and a handful of American investors as well, and there are certain investors who are really driving this issue and have been driving the issue for a long time in all markets. So I think it's more the kind of overarching interest, but maybe also mandate. I think we also need to remember that maybe American investors, and we've seen the ESG woke conversation, it might be harder for them to include not this kind of hard material directly business bottom line related issues publicly, at least in their operations. But it'd be interesting to see if they have the internal interest and maybe doing it more in the inside, if not publicly. So I think that could also be a consideration, how much people can talk about these things and what they are open to doing. But yeah, I would also agree that there's of work to be done. And I think the tech is an interesting example where we have seen also in Nordic countries that children's rights isn't something that happens or bothers someone else somewhere far away, but it's the children in around us, people, children that we connect with every day, who also face risks. So even though it's a sad example of a risk expanding, but it's also be a good reminder for us in the Nordics that we shouldn't take children's rights for granted.
Thank you, great insights.
If I may add something, I forget, Petra, exactly what your original question was, so I will answer two questions that I interpret that we were talking about. I think the tech industry is really interesting in the sense that the challenges that children face here in the Nordics, of course, are very different that the children face in some of the maybe lower middle income countries. So for instance, I know they talked about like the mental health consequences that tech may have, particularly for teenagers. And then in other parts of the world, we're talking about how do we even get children connected? Like if they're in school, how do we get schools connected to the internet? So just also realizing the fact that there are challenges related to tech and they're different depending on sort of where you are. But then the other thing that I wanted to highlight relates to this this sort of Nordic leadership and maybe just a few words about the work that UNICEF Finland is doing with Evli in Finland currently. I don't know if you had the opportunity to read the blog that was posted before this event, but we are currently sort of diving into how are Finnish listed companies performing as far as child rights, and then also with Evli, particularly on the investor point of view, looking at the tool for investors and seeing what are the most important issues that come out of that, and how would an investor go about integrating that into their operations. So I feel like we're definitely for Finland leading the way, trying to dive into this, trying to find the key messages and to take this forward. And we look forward to doing that with all of you across the Nordics. I don't know, Petra, if you want to add something about that.
Yeah, I mean, good that you took it up, and I think the tool for investors is a really good concrete way to kind of go through key indicators that we as investors could then start integrating into our own processes. And it's a great start to go on with. So definitely a great suggestion for those who haven't had a look at it before. We have an audience question that we could take. So the question is, regarding the impact of digital media and other company activities on children's mental health, how much of a role should the legislator take? Have any of you seen any concrete government intervention within the area? Any insights on this?
Yeah, I don't know if the child rights experts here want to chip in, but I think a good example, or just an example, is I'm not sure this is really the best practice or the right way to go about it, but China, for example, they have legislation on or some kind of regulation for how many hours children can spend online, for example, per day, I think. So maybe that's not exactly the only way to legislating, but I think it's also a good reminder for us that different countries are facing the same challenges and addressing them in a different way. So I think that's one interesting example from Chinese legislature actually trying to act on the issue. In the UK, I think many of us saw there was a legal challenge towards I think it's still ongoing, but which came to court last year on social media companies, or where the social media companies were sued as a consequence to a teenage girl. I think she was 15 at the time, who was prone to self-harm and suicidal. Thanks to how the algorithms work, she kept being bombarded with more and more information that kind of fed her self-destructive thoughts, and ended up taking her own life in the end, unfortunately. And there is a court case, I think it's still ongoing, in the UK, where the social media companies were actually called to court to answer to the questions and explain how they are aware of these kind of risks in their business model and operations, and how do they see their responsibility, and how are they becoming better to avoid that kind of unintended consequences, even if algorithms are legal, but they should go beyond the legal compliance. I think it's also a good thing to remember that even if the companies don't break the law, there are things that they might do wrong that are legal, actually.
Good insights. We have another question in the chat. What is a reasonable time frame for companies struggling with children's rights issues to address and solve such issues? Any thoughts?
I'm happy to try to start on that one. So I guess my question, it really depends. It's it does, I would say, depend on the types of impacts, the issues, where they are within the company's operation, supply chain. I mean, there are a number of factors here that kind of would impact the time frame. But what we would like to see is that companies are, of course, we would like to see that they generally have policies, governance structures, and risk management processes, and that are set up to be able to address these things. But if they do not in advance of potential child rights issues, we would like to see that these companies are addressed when we want to see them taking steps towards addressing the issues. Is this discussed at the board level or by executive management? What actions are you taking? How are you addressing this in as part of your business, operations, your depending on your sector and a business model. Sorry. So we want to see companies really taking steps and set for our engagement. We set clear KPIs for each engagement, and that varies from company to company, from engagement to engagement. In one case, it may be that we want to see management of a certain type of risk. In another one, it may be disclosure, it may be clear governance structure. So I guess there's not one answer, but we want to see progress over time.
Thanks, Caroline.
Petra, I can maybe add to that as well. I mean, I agree with Caroline that it really depends on the issue and the business. I think we would all agree that certain things like child labour, as a society, we all agree is bad. And as Caroline said, that child labour is almost moving down the supply chains. So it's hard to fix the problem, but I think as a society we all agree that it's wrong and needs to be fixed. There are other issues that I think are a bit grayer. So when it comes to marketing food, our definitions of what healthy food is vary. And if a business's core product is selling an unhealthy product that is advertised to children, that's almost a societal conversation we need to have about, can they market, what can they do, and legislators are stepping into that space. But that's a much more complicated issue to deal with than child labour, which I think we all agree on. So it depends on the issue, it depends on the business, and it depends on the context and the society. So there's a convoluted answer, but I think Carol and I kind of are on the same page.
Thank you, ma'am. Great.
You just said it much more clearly. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I think our time is running out. Thanks a lot for all of you for joining us as speakers, and thanks also to the audience for joining and for the good questions. As a final note, this was our first Nordic SIF event. So for the future ones, we're very happy to get any suggestions on topics to be discussed. So if you have any ideas in your mind, get in touch with your respective SIFs. But thanks again. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.